In this video, I will show you that it still just might be possible to make a nice looking table without live edge, epoxy, or Rubio monocoat. Well, kinda. So, for those of you that are still here and aren't too upset at me for the intro, I decided I wanted to make a table with a bunch of new techniques to me to just, help me be a better woodworker. I'm going to start out with some 8/4 red oak for the base. I would normally use white oak, but I'm planning to dye the base black, and I have a ton of red oak lying around that I really need to use up. I decided to try a hand-carved pedestal base for this project, which I have never actually done before. So basically right now I'm making 2 circles that I will stack on top of each other, and then also the post that will sit in the center. People who are familiar with woodworking know that there are definitely a couple of ways to cut out circles, but I think nothing beats my extremely complex plywood circle jig for my router. I'm using a really small 1/8 of an inch straight bit here, and that's really for no reason in particular. It may just help cut through the wood a bit easier since it's a smaller bit, but that's really about it. Once I get the small circle routed, I struggled a bit more than I should having to get this small nail out. Alright, cutting the circles out were a bit harder than they should have been too. The bandsaw that I have is really not made for cutting 2-inch oak. I seem to like pushing my tools to their limits more often than I should, but I will upgrade them probably sooner or later. Once I get that off the bandsaw, I will use a flush trim bit in my router table to clean up the bottom circle piece for the base. I'm not so worried about getting the smaller circle that I will glue on top of the piece perfect, since it will mostly be power carved down anyways. Now I can do my best impression of a cake baker and lather up the top piece of cake with some icing, and then I can stack it on the bottom piece of cake. Unlike a cake though, I want to make sure the grain is running in the same direction in both pieces, since I want the wood to not expand and contract in opposite directions. Sometimes in woodworking, you definitely have to get a little creative with your clamping to make sure you get a good tight squeeze, as you will see a bit later in this video. For this glue up though, I will just use some scrap wood pieces as some cauls to make sure I can get good even pressure on the entire piece. Just to make sure I have proper alignment, I'm using some dowels here to attach the center post. Looking back on this video, I wish I would have moved them in just a bit closer to the center, as the placement I use will end up causing me just a little problem in the future. I had a little struggle getting a perfect alignment, so I had to go back and make the holes a hair wider just to get the dowels to fit down in there. Once I had it dry fitted, I could go ahead and glue it up. I wanted to make sure to use a ton of glue here since I'm doing an end grain to face grain bond, which isn't the strongest joint you can have. So I was hoping the dowels that I used would add just a bit of extra strength. As I was gluing this up, I realized I forgot to cut the post down to final length, so I did that real quick since it would be much more difficult once I had it glued to the base. I used some brute force and ignorance to pound the post home. I really wanted to make sure there were going to be no gaps around the bottom. Here's where the clamping creativity really comes into play. Not only was it 90 degrees in my shop, so I had to hurry, but there was no one around to help me. In order to hold the clamp in place on the far side, I had to use the patented chin hold technique to hold the scrap in place until I had the other clamp ready to go. This was definitely not the most glamorous method, but hey, it got the job done. Another thing I was worried about when gluing the post was making sure it was square to the base. If it was out of square just a little bit, it would have caused the tops to be way out of line and not parallel to the ground. To my surprise, it was actually right on the money, and I'm glad it was square on my first try because I really had no clue how to fix it if it wasn't. So, I will admit, even though I look pretty scary here, I was a little intimidated to start power carving for the first time. I'm not going to lie, I had to look up some safety tips to make sure I was wearing the right equipment and use the proper technique. But, I'd rather do that than rip my finger off or something. I bought this 2 pack of power carving discs off Amazon for like 15 bucks. I mostly went for the cheaper version because I wanted to make sure I really liked power carving before I invested a few $100s in some higher end discs. For future projects, I'm planning on investing in some Cutsaw or Arbortech discs to make life a little bit easier. But for 15 bucks, the discs that I used did just fine. I will leave a link to them down in the description below, as well as the other tools I like to use. One thing I quickly learned about power carving is it makes a huge mess and it takes a dang long time. I think I underestimated the shaping process of the base just a little bit. It took me probably, I would say, a good 4 or 5 hours of carving just to get the shape right. I wanted the base to flow into the post as best as it could, and for a guy who doesn't really know what he's doing, this was not an easy task for me. I switched over to the sanding flap disc, and eventually I got to work with a spoke shave. And this was a pretty fun tool to use, to be honest. This just helps out smooth out all the high spots and gouges that you can kind of see there on the post. I had to experiment with a couple of different positions, but sometimes I guess that's not a bad thing. Anyways, I could only use the spoke shave on the post since that's kind of the way the tool and the blade is designed. So I switched over to my belt sander to help get the last of the deep gouges out of the post and to smooth out the base. If you've been looking closely for the last minute or two of the video, you may have noticed the 2 holes on the base. These are actually the dowel holes that I ended up carving through. Luckily, I did have a pretty easy way that I thought I could fix this. My idea was to take the area and drill it out and make the larger hole more uniform. Then I could fill it with a dowel. Of course, my drill was set on the fast speed and it tore out a big chunk of the hole. I sanded down 2 dowels to fit in the holes and I ended up making another rookie mistake. I forgot to align the grain with the post to allow it to become more hidden and blend in better. At this point, I was a little annoyed with myself because I kept making kind of dumb mistakes, but I decided to still share this mistake with the world because I'm not a robot and I make mistakes and so does everyone else. Everyone knows the phrase, and I'm definitely probably saying this wrong, but the best woodworkers are just better at hiding their mistakes. I feel like in this day and age with social media, all that's shown is perfection, and it makes people feel like they're the only one who makes mistakes. But that's definitely not true. Mistakes have to be made to grow as a woodworker. It means you're trying new things, and as long as you don't do the same mistake again the next time, you're good. If you do, well, at that point, it's kind of your fault. So, at the beginning of this video, I said there would be no epoxy for this project, but I lied. So, not only do I make mistakes, but I'm a liar too. There was just a little knot that kind of needed to be covered up, so I just used a little bit of 5-minute epoxy and it did the trick. In order to make the table base not wobble, I needed to carve out the center. This just allows the table to sit on a ring instead of sitting on an entire circle that could just bow and rock a little bit over time. This idea came from Blacktail Studio and it's honestly a great idea. So many people would be quick to say that red oak is an ugly wood, and I wouldn't necessarily always disagree with them, but when used the right way, I think it can still look really nice. I decided to dye the base black for a couple of reasons. For starters, I just wanted to try something new with this black dye that I'm using. And 2, I wanted the base to contrast with the top a little bit, but not outshine it. Now, here's an unpopular opinion, but when people work with bright colored epoxies in like a live edge, walnut, or maple dining table, I personally think there's too much going on and it's just like a sensory overload. The colors of the wood and epoxy are just trying to compete with each other, and the epoxy tends to overshadow the beautiful natural colors in the wood. But that's just my opinion, and if you think that's the dumbest thing you've ever heard, and I'm just a kid with no taste, be sure to just roast me in the comments. If you agree with me though, I might need some backup defending myself. For the top of this table, I had a few boards of this 5/4 curly maple lying around. And when I was designing this table, I actually came up with the design for the bottom before the top, which is usually a little backwards. Usually when you're building a table, you figure out the top first, and the bottom is usually something that kind of complements or adds to the top a little bit. But it was kind of the other way around for this project. I knew I wanted a blackened carved base, but it took me a bit to think of which wood would look best for the top. Eventually, I thought the lighter tan colors of the maple would look great with the black base. I realized after that most of my projects or my theme is kind of those exact two color combos, tan and black. My logo, my workbench, my sign on the wall, and my shirts are pretty much all this color. So I guess this top was just meant to be. You may notice that smaller circle in the middle of the bottom of this table, and that will be so I can attach the base to the top once it's finished. For now though, I'm cutting out the perimeter of the tabletop with my jigsaw because my little bandsaw would quite literally not even cut through this maple at all. In hindsight, I should have just used the jigsaw for the other circles because it ripped right through the material. But once that's all cut out, I'll just flush trim the rest of the waste. Now we can go back to that little circle. I'm removing the inside of it to allow for a piece that will be attached to the bottom to sit down inside of it. If that doesn't make any sense, it will. Trust me. But I'm using a Forstner bit to try to get most of the waste out. And whatever's left, I will use this quote unquote jig, which is actually just a piece of plywood that is screwed onto my router to remove the rest of the waste. A piece of plexiglass would have been better just to help me see and for video purposes, but it is what it is. Once I was happy with the depth of cut, I could move on to the edge profile. And instead of just doing a 60-degree chamfer like it seems is growing to become more and more popular, I wanted to try something different. I recently got this larger 3/4 of an inch roundover bit, and I wanted to try doing a pillowing effect. I'm not sure if it's actually called pillowing or I just made that word up, but basically I want to use like around 3/4 of the entire bit so I don't have a full roundover, but instead something that has a softer edge and reveal. Once that's done, I can sand up to 180 grit and prepare for a different finish than what I would normally use. My goal was to get a glossier finish on the top to make it stand out a bit. I usually hate glossy finishes, but for a project like this, I thought it actually might look nice next to the matte black base. I'm using a water-based polyacrylic for my finish, and I started out with a paint roller, but as you can see, it left behind a ton of bubbles. So I came back with a soft brush just to get rid of and pop the bubbles. Once I had 3 coats built up on both sides, I was ready to sand this down. The nice thing about this water-based finish is it dries much faster than an oil-based finish would dry. So this allows me to build up coats faster than normal. You can see those bright lines there, and that's just the deeper brush strokes that I still have to get out with the sander. Once they're gone though, I know I'm good to move on to the next higher grit. I started at 400 grit and ended up working my way up to 3000 grit. I decided I liked the sheen I was at around 3000, so I just stopped there. I could have gone a much higher if I wanted to get a more glossy finish, but I didn't think that was really necessary. Alright, so here's another lie. I said I wasn't going to use Rubio Monocoat in the beginning, but here I am again. What I meant was I'm not using Rubio Monocoat as the main finish. I'm just applying it over top as a wax just to kind of bring out the curl in the wood and act as an extra layer of protection. Alright, I have to admit, this type of finish has to be one of my new all-time favorites. The polyacrylic provides such a durable layer of protection, and the Rubio just brings it all to life. Not only is it beautiful, but it's extremely smooth and uniform as well, since I've sanded it up to such a high grit. The Rubio I applied on the base also helped to bring out a nice little sheen to the matte black that looked nice. Something that didn't look nice though was the edge on this table. I got a really non-uniform layer finish and it really just looked ugly and unprofessional and just needed to go. My only option was to sand the edges off and try again. I'm not really sure what caused this to be so splotchy, but I was really careful the second time to sand and finish the edges properly. I sprayed down the edges with water just to get the grain pop out, and this time I only sanded to 180 grit because I thought maybe the surface was just a little too smooth for the polyacrylic to evenly penetrate. Whatever it was though, I ended up getting a much nicer and uniform finish that was acceptable. I was careful to try not to get any on the top, and if I did, I just wiped it off with a rag. Once that was dry though, I could reapply the Rubio and move on to figuring out how to attach this sucker. Like I said before, I needed to cut out a circle to fit perfectly inside the cutout I made in the center of the table. I pre-drilled and used a countersink bit to allow for the screw heads to sit flush. Some people, though, think that if you use screws in your woodworking project, your table will just expand and crack and eventually just spontaneously combust and just blow up. But I'm here to tell you, on a project this small, wood movement is not going to be an issue. Alright, I got a little carried away there with my new fancy camera, and I'm sure nobody wants to see every single freckle on my face. Anyways, I'm curious to know if you think the way I'm attaching this table to the base was a good solution. I left the round piece a bit thick just to make sure it was going to be strong and stable. I made sure to align the grain too to make sure if there was any wood movement, it would be in the same direction. So let me know down below if you think this was a good idea or if you would have done it differently. Alright, now I can attempt to take some decent pictures of this thing, because if you're trying to sell a project, this often can be the most important. Something I recommend is just to get a paper background. I've seen people use folded up tablecloths and it just looks bad. Here's what I came up with. I'm still working on improving my photography skills, and since I'm a woodworker and not a photographer, this takes some time, but I don't think these turned out too bad. Anyways, that's all for me. If you made it this far and still aren't subscribed, I honestly don't know what you're doing here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.